The Russ Hayward podcast today, focusing on family business, gave us a great opportunity to discuss succession planning. And then I thought you really came up with a great way of looking at it in a different way, Mike, saying, no, it's ownership planning. Can you talk about that?
I think that the podcast was great, and the focus on succession planning I think is a good focus, but I think the use of the word succession planning sometimes traps people or has people freeze in their seat because it has a connotation associated, right?
We say succession,
like if you're young and you're just getting into business, you're not really thinking about succession. I like to call it ownership planning. Some people call it exit planning, but they say, well, I'm not exiting, or transition planning, I'm not transitioning. I think ownership planning covers the gamut of making a plan for your ownership, maybe your shares, but also your management, and your management rights and responsibilities.
Yeah. So we use that as a basis to really talk with our family business owners around what would their ownership planning look like, and we got into defining shareholders agreements and some of the key things that should be in a shareholders agreement, and those spanned from how do we define our roles and our salaries to what would be the way that we would invest the profits from the business and distribute the profits of the business.
Yeah, I mean, we always say fences make good neighbors and agreements make for good partners, assuming people put the effort into it. And as one of our members said, we don't necessarily need to use the agreement, and that's very true, only to the extent that they can agree. If partners get along, they can make their decisions in day to day, but having that shareholders agreement or operating agreement is really critical to govern the shares and the transfer or disposition of the same, and like you said, management responsibilities and allocations of profits and losses and all these things that go into ownership. Even guarantee of debt sometimes is called out in the shareholders agreement.
Right. Well, we talked about the fact that sometimes our family business owners are different ages, and so they may want to leave the business sooner versus later in some cases, and so being able to set up in the family business shareholder agreement what would be the valuation methodology, what would happen if a person chooses to leave the business, maybe because of health or maybe because of retirement, what happens to those shares, and spelling that out so that there's nothing left to chance. Or we talked about even what if a divorce happens in the family.
That's and a very sticky area, but you referenced, I think importantly, the influencers in the business, and most people are married or have a relationship, and you get ownership in a business, it becomes part of your marital estate or your marital property, and having that discussion with your spouse or other influencers up front is really important. We talked a little bit about guarantees. Your spouse may have to guarantee a debt. If you don't have that discussion up front, you may run into some stickiness.
Yeah, so often with family business, we talk about the owners of the family business. But today at the Roundtable, we actually talked about having better communication with the influencers, the non-owners of the family business, the sister-in-laws, the father-in-law, the wife, right? The husband. Of what their roles are as being non-members of a family business, and setting up some boundaries and expectations of how they can be helpful versus how they can hurt the owners of the business.
And we heard examples where the ownership may resolve problems or disputes, but the solutions don't resonate out into the greater family.
Correct.
And therefore hard feelings may still ensue even though the problem is solved and moved on. So that setting up parameters and expectations is really important.
Yeah. So today, again, in our discussion, we talked about the role of good communications, both written owners agreements and shareholders agreements, to also the verbal communication that has to happen between business owners involved in the business and those influencers who are not. And that gave us a great way to use those learnings in our everyday roles as family business owners.
Another great and engaging discussion.
Absolutely.
Thank you.